On behalf of the American Heart Association, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Operationalizing Targeted Temperature Management. My name is Liz Olson, and I'm the Senior Quality Programs Manager for the American Heart Association. Today's webinar is possible with support from Becton, Dickinson and Company. I'd like to begin by going over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can download a PDF in the handouts section of your attendee control panel. If you experience technical difficulties, most user issues can be resolved by refreshing your browser. If that does not work, please contact the GoToWebinar customer service team found in your confirmation and reminder email. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a link to access today's recording, as well as an invitation to complete our feedback survey. We welcome you to submit text questions for our presenters at any time in the questions pane of the control panel. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. It's my pleasure to now introduce our speakers for today. Myra Smith is the Emergency Code Coordinator and Data Abstractor, Rapid Response Team Leader, and Sepsis Coordinator at the Mobile Infirmary Medical Center. And with us also is Dr. Harrison Pearl. Dr. Pearl is a neurologist and the Medical Director of Neuroscience Division at Mobile Infirmary Medical Center. It's my pleasure to now turn today's presentation over to Myra Smith.
Good morning, guys, all those that decided to call in and participate with us today. Just a few disclosures and conflicts of interest. Neither I nor my immediate family had any financial relationship, interest, or proprietary entity producing healthcare goods, commercial products, or services related to the content of this presentation. I do not intend to discuss an unimproved investigative use of commercial products and devices, but I am currently a volunteer on the Resuscitation Systems of Care Advisory Group Commission through the American Heart Association. And also, as a disclosure, the American Heart Association does not endorse any of the products or devices that will be discussed in this webinar. So just a little bit about the Mobile Infirmary Medical Center. Here in Mobile, Alabama, we were founded in 1910. We are the largest non-for-profit in the state of Alabama. We have multiple certifications. We are a primary stroke center. We are a bariatric surgery center. We specialize in cancer care, TAVRs and microclip services, and we are a robotic surgery training center. I do have listed a couple of our awards that we have received. We do use Get With The Guidelines for our resuscitation, our stroke, heart failure, and Mission Lifeline. So that's just a little bit about the Mobile Infirmary. For today's webinar, we have a few learning objectives. We want to discuss the science of targeted temperature management. We also plan to review current American Heart Association's guidelines that are recommended for TTM. We also want to identify best practice and process improvement initiatives that we implemented here at the Mobile Infirmary Medical Center to comply with the AHA TTM recommendations. And then we also want to describe how opportunities for process improvement can facilitate success with performance initiatives. So I'm going to turn it over this part of the presentation to Dr. Pearl to give us a little bit of the science with TTM.
Good morning. So throughout the history of modern medicine and tracking neurologic injury, anoxic brain injury from cardiac arrest is one of the most devastating and difficult to treat brain injuries that we see. Therapeutic hypothermia or targeted temperature management is indicated for patients who remain comatose following ROSC and in hospital or out of hospital cardiac arrest. And since we have started providing this for patients, it has become increasingly important to emphasize this following cardiac arrest for patients who are eligible for it, because this is truly the only treatment that we have that has shown any benefit to improve outcomes in patients with anoxic brain injury. We've tried other things, looking at different therapies that target different parts of the injury cascade that we'll talk about in just a moment. But all the other things that we've tried have not shown any benefit. This includes things like calcium channel blockers, sedatives like barbiturates and benzodiazepines, optimizing different electrolytes like magnesium, and even steroids. But all of these in trials have not shown any benefit. Only mild hypothermia has. So when there is cessation of the pump that provides blood flow to the brain, the brain, things change very quickly. We deplete oxygen within 10 seconds, and the electrical physiology of the brain changes very fast. Then within just a few minutes, we use up all of our energy stores and glucose stores. And so the brain injury actually starts within 2, 3, 4 minutes after cessation of blood flow. But it starts a cascade of injury that is extremely malignant, ultimately resulting in release of excitatory neurotransmitters and influxes of malignant ions like calcium that really synergistically ramp up the injury very quickly. But even when we achieve reperfusion, the injury continues. The reperfusion in itself perpetuates more injury. So you have to have reperfusion for survival, but it in itself causes more injury. There's membrane destabilization. Cells begin to swell. The blood-brain barrier begins to break down. You have water going in between neurons, in neurons. Literally everything starts to fall apart fairly quickly. So therapeutic hypothermia helps to negate a lot of those different processes. You decrease the metabolic demand of the brain. You decrease the splitting of glucose, which is producing lactic acid. You stabilize the influx of the excitatory neurotransmitters and ions. You have stabilization of the blood-brain barrier and decrease in swelling. You have decrease in the free radical production, which injures the membranes of neurons. So there's multiple different facets of the injury process that are attenuated by mild hypothermia.
So the next slide talks about post-cardiac arrest care for adults via the American Heart Association. So what this says is that after you've achieved ROSC on your patient, you should start deciding what type of treatment you need to administer to this patient. And when you look at targeted temperature management, the type of questions you want to see is the patient following commands? If the patient is awake, then you just look at other critical care treatment and management. If the patient is not, and they're comatose, then you want to start considering TTM. If you look to the box where it discusses TTM, it should be made high priority. The patient, you want to start it as soon as possible, and you look to cool your patients between 32 to 36 degrees Celsius for 24 hours by using a cooling device. And then you want to be able to continuously monitor the patients. So here at Mobile Infirmary, when I took a look at our targeted temperature management process, it was discovered that we really didn't have a set process. So the things that I had to complete in order to get us to where we could do process improvement was we conducted a gap analysis. And so we made the decision back in 2018 to really kind of focus on what we were doing for our patients post-cardiac arrest. We wanted to identify our stakeholders, the people in the organization who we needed to discuss TTM with, making sure we had it available for staff and for patients. We needed to develop our policies and bring them up, to current date and time. Our policies had been very antiquated at the time that we looked at this. We wanted to establish training and competency requirements. We really didn't have that. We wanted to conduct equipment trials, and we needed to establish measures for success and benchmarks. We also wanted to drill down our data to look for opportunities for improvement, and then to present the outcome measures at our quality review board for accountability. So when I started doing a deep dive into this, we had already had 2 Artixon devices that we bought some years earlier. Now, Mobile Infirmary is a 600+ bed hospital. We only had 2 devices. And the only staff that had been trained to use our devices were the ICU nurses in our coronary care unit, which is a 12-bed ICU for post-cardiac cath and other type of cardiac injury patients. And then there was no data being collected on the patients being cooled. The only data that we had was the data that was available via getting reports from the actual devices. And we also discovered that we weren't using these devices to their fullest capacity. And at that time, we also decided to trial a new device from Zoll, which was the ThermoGuard endovascular cooling catheters, alongside with our Artixon cooling pad devices. And then with that data, I would gather and present to leadership and the stakeholders of the organization to decide which route we wanted to go as far as cooling our patients. So this is just a picture here of the Zoll catheter device. And when we conducted the trials, I was able to gather advantages and disadvantages to the devices. With the Zoll endovascular catheter, it was very user-friendly for our critical care physicians. They recommended using the device. It was, you know, a little bit larger than putting in a central line, but they thought that the process was pretty easy. It was able to cool our patients at a faster rate than the Artixon pads. And then you can also use those for rewarming and normothermia. And another advantage to the Zoll catheter was that it provided a central line for medication and fluid administration, and that the line could stay in place for 4 days to reduce the risk of infection. The disadvantages for us for using the Zoll catheter was they had a potential for the patient to bleed, and also, you know, you can get a line infection. We also did not currently have them in-house, so we would have to purchase or get a rental agreement to get those devices. And then the patient would need a new line after the 4 days was up, when you had to switch that line out. The other disadvantage with us with this device was that the patients could only be in CCU, because that was the staff that was trained to take care of those. But we did have a goal to expand it to the other ICUs once the program was started. Now, these are the Artixon cooling pad system, which we already had in-house. So some advantages for us with the Artixon is that they can be placed by nursing staff. The pads can be safely left on the patient for 5 days. The pads were safe for MRI, CT scan, X-ray, and cath lab. We had already had 2 devices in-house. The staff could initiate them in the ER, and then we had trained staff, ICU nurses in both our coronary care unit and our medical intensive care unit to utilize the devices. So we had more bed space for those patients. And it was a non-invasive therapy, so there was no risk for CLAPSI or DVT. The disadvantages to the Artixon pads for us was the staff. They had to record the water temperature, the water and patient temperature, hourly, and it took longer to cool than the invasive therapy. So what did our data show after we kind of trialed these 2 devices? Well, I wanted to get some baseline data on how we compared. So when I looked at our percent of patients with pulseless cardiac events who survived to discharge, because what I wanted to see was, okay, we're going to cool patients, but how many patients do we typically have that survive cardiac arrest and survive to discharge? So when I looked at it, our baseline was 26.1%, and this data is from calendar year 2019. So, and then I compared us to all the hospitals in Alabama on the Get With The Guidelines site, and it was about 24%. And then nationwide, with all hospitals who used to get with the guidelines, the survival rate was about 27.4%. So we were kind of right there with national guidelines, the data that shows how many patients survive to inpatient to discharge following an inpatient cardiac arrest. So then I looked at our targeted temperature management data. So I collected data for a full calendar year, and what it showed was that we cooled a total of 43 patients for calendar year 2019. Now, remind you, I didn't have any baseline data on how many patients we typically cool, so this was all fresh data. Of the 43 patients, 33% of those patients expired and 24% survived, which was 10 patients. But what was interesting is when I looked, now the patients that were cool, they met criteria and some of them did not meet. We were just kind of cooling everybody. But what was interesting is if you look at the next bar graph, the patients who met criteria that we did not cool for whatever reason, 67% of those patients survived. So it was 15 patients for the calendar year 19 that we did not cool who should have been cool. They met criteria to be cool. And only 5 of those patients expired. So what this showed was that we were not doing a correct selection process for choosing which patients to cool. We were cooling wrong patients, but we weren't cooling patients who should have been cool. So we knew right then we had an issue that we needed to address, which is who should we be cooling, who should we not be cooling. And so of the 43 patients that we cooled, 31 met criteria to be cool and 12 did not. So when you look at that breakdown, of the 31 patients who met criteria, 22 expired, 9 survived. And then of the 12 who did not meet, 11 expired, 1 survived. So what we had to do to change our practice here at Mobile Infirmary is that we had to sit down and look at our policies and our protocols. Our policies, when we looked at them, were for our old cooling blanket systems. We had done some Arctic Sun updates to our policy, but I wasn't sure how often we had been looking at them and actually utilizing what the policy stated for us to do. So we then looked at the training and competency requirements of the staff that were able to cool patients. So we didn't really have annual training. We would utilize the Arctic Sun team. They had a rep who would come, and when we felt like, we had kind of had a lot of turnover or we had more staff that needed to be trained, we would call them in to come and do training. But it wasn't something that was like dedicated quarterly or yearly where the training had been completed. So we also started doing mock code blue drills. We already had mock code blue drills, but we decided to incorporate doing TTM as a part of the drill with the staff each quarter. And then we needed to monitor measures of success as compared to our benchmark data. So when we looked at this, all the benchmark data we had was the data that I gathered for the calendar year 2019. And so we wanted to look at that data and see how did we assess for opportunities for improvement. So we would look at, the patients that we cooled that did not meet criteria. Why did we cool them? Why did they think it was a good idea to cool a 90-year-old patient who had a baseline of dementia on admission? We also looked at patients that we did not cool who should have been cooled to see why didn't we cool that patient. And when I went back to review, I saw a lot of notes that were entered either from the nursing staff or the physician staff that would say, TTM not initiated, patient too unstable. And then when you see that, I had to dig a little further to say, well, what did they mean by saying the patient was too unstable? If they weren't bleeding, if they did not have a baseline precognitive status that was already diminished, what was the reason we weren't cooling those patients. And the reasons would vary. A lot of times it was patients that ended up having to go for a lot of testing procedures. Maybe they went to the cath lab or they needed to go to MRI and CT, and the physician staff really just didn't feel comfortable with, they didn't know what their scope of what they could do with the patient with those cooling pads on. Could they take them to the operating room? Could they go through different testing devices with the cooling pads on? So that was a lot of the hiccups that I saw when I looked into this data and did a deep dive. And we also decided that a lot of issues we see when we need process improvement, we kind of always look to what type of nurse-driven protocols we can do. And that was one of the reasons we stuck with the Arctic Sun, because the physician can give the order and the nurses can apply it. They don't have to try to put in a central line device like the Zoll catheter. But when we decided to start talking about it a lot more, sorry guys, I'm sorry, emergency response speaker.
Southeast, rapid response team, team 2, CT.
So sorry.
Holding, ground floor, southeast.
So what we also discovered with our devices is that the two Arctic Sun devices that we had, they were kept in our CCU, ICU, but they were kind of cleaned and covered and under a counter. And they were kind of an afterthought when we would have code blue events. But what we did notice is when we started asking the doctors more at code blue events, hey, would you like to consider TTM? They were eager to implement it. It was just kind of an out of sight, out of mind situation that we just needed to talk about a little bit more. What we also decided to do was to expand the staff that were trained. So not only were our CCU staff trained and then our MICU staff, we also decided we needed to address the problem of patients getting admitted through our emergency department who were having out of hospital cardiac arrest events and start cooling those patients. Our hospital here, we have 3 sister hospital facilities where we get their critically ill and sicker patients. And so we were having patients they would come in from our sister facilities having had a cardiac arrest, and the downtime was less than 6 hours. And we said, well, we have an opportunity where we can start cooling those patients to see if we could get some results. One of the other changes that we were able to update was our code blue critique form. Now we are still currently on paper charting for our code blue. We do plan to transition to, we have a code blue narrator in Epic that we plan to transition to pretty soon. But I found that adding the verbiage of the criteria for TTM to the actual debrief form increased our utilization of the devices. So, it was like out of sight, out of mind. Well, let's put something in front of the staff's face. So when they're filling out this after each code blue event, it rings the bell to say, oh, we should ask the physicians, do they want to consider cooling this patient? So we added the inclusion and exclusion criteria to our debriefing form. And with our contraindications for use, uncontrolled active bleeding, greatly increased risk of bleeding, uncontrolled cardiac arrest greater than 6 hours. And the majority of the patients that we cooled that did not meet criteria, this was the reason. It had been greater than 6 hours that they arrested, or they had an unknown downtime. Also your DNR or end-stage terminal illness patients, and then patients who have a minimal pre-arrest cognitive status. Our inclusion criteria were patients who were status post-cardiac arrest without return of normal neurological function. Our comatose patients with the Glasgow Coma Scale of less than or equal to 8. Patients that were age greater than 18, and patients that had been intubated with mechanical ventilation. So when I gathered all this data, our presenting the data to the committees, we have our HQIC, which is our quality committee, the critical care committee, and the code blue committee. So I was able to take this data and present it to the different committees to get their feedback on how, the process improvement would work. And so when I looked at our 2019 data, this is a graph that compares the patients that were cooled in 2019. So 76% of those patients expired and 24% survived. Now, when you look at the next graph, it's the total patients for January through March of 2020. So that's kind of where I'm working on data since then. We all know that COVID happened and turned everybody's world upside down. But when I looked at us putting into place the process improvements that we had been working on for January through March of this year, we've only cooled 7 patients. But of those 7 patients, every patient met criteria. And 3 of those patients survived to discharge, which gives us a survival rate up from 24% to 43%. And when I looked at those 3 patients were able to go to rehab and to go home with little to no defects or deficits post cardiac arrest. So this showed us in our organization that we needed to drill down and focus on cooling the correct patients instead of trying to cool everybody, which was kind of like throwing mud at a wall to see what would stick. But it showed us when we actually were selective with our criteria that our mortality rates and what we wanted to see was more patients surviving and going home without deficits has actually increased. So as I complete the rest of the data to 2020, our hope is that that trend has continued with us being more selective with who we're cooling. And again, that 19 graph includes patients who were cool who did not meet criteria. So we thought that this shows the potential of having a good outlook that maybe our process improvement is working. Time will tell, and the rest of the data for this year will tell if it actually holds up. But I think that deep diving and looking at what your issue is and not being afraid to say, okay, we have a problem. Let's sit down, let's brainstorm, let's figure out how to work on this to make sure we're utilizing the equipment we have, we're utilizing our resources, and that we are actually providing a service to our patients that will help them and decrease the chances of them discharging and having a deficit, if you have the measures to do so.
Yeah, I think that's great, Myra. I think this data is really powerful to show that if you want to bring in a new innovative initiative to your hospital with something like targeted temperature management and therapeutic hypothermia, the patient selection is very important. In any neurological trial looking at outcomes, no matter if it's mechanical thrombectomy or what therapy you want to look at, patient selection has always been very important to see the outcome benefit, to prove it as beneficial. And we saw that here at our hospital, even on a limited data standpoint. And then whenever we drilled down that data and found out who we were cooling and who we were not cooling and for what reasons, and we started cooling the right people, you really see the data change and the outcomes improve. So it's very important whenever you initiate this at your hospital that you select the right patients so that you will see the outcomes that will continue to drive the program forward.
And to add on to that, when I first presented our data, of course, the stakeholders were like, we're not purchasing new devices for y'all to use when the numbers don't show we're helping anybody. You're going to use what you have and perfect that or get that to a point where we're actually seeing improvement before we invest, tens of thousands of dollars into devices where we already don't use the devices we've already paid tens of thousands of dollars for. But once I was able to show them that we were utilizing, I was able to get them behind me a little bit more to say, okay, well, maybe we can increase the number of devices we have now since we are cooling the correct patients, our hospital size is, larger, and we can perhaps provide this service to more patients because we're actually doing our due diligence and being responsible with the devices that we have, and we are showing better outcomes. All right, Liz.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for leading today's webinar. We'll move into our Q&A section now. And just as a reminder, you can still submit questions for our presenters through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. I want to also just share that in the chat, the 2020 American Heart Association guidelines for CPR and ECC were updated last week. And you can view those at the link included. So we had several questions related to neurological outcome after cooling, and specifically around CPC scores. Do you know, did you have any data or take a look at CPC scores or neurological outcome from TTM in your facility?
Yes, I do. I don't have the exact report pull from Get With the Guidelines, but just in reviewing the data, our patients that survived to discharge probably, and I would have to pull it for the actual data, but to just kind of give you guys a roundabout, probably about 50% of those patients in that first group that we cooled for 2019, half of them discharged home to hospice. We only had about 5 who discharged and were able to go to a rehab facility to work on their whatever their deficiencies were when they were discharged. But half of those patients did discharge home to a hospice. The ones that discharged to a rehab, their CPC scores was kind of the same as admission. But I would have to go and pull my report. That's a good question too, Liz, and I'll have to go back and get on my Get With the Guidelines page to pull and see what that CPC scores look like. But I know that half of them discharge home on hospice.
Great. Question of my own, but you talked about working with some of your sister facilities, and I'm just curious, as you were developing changes to your code forms and identifying processes, did you work with any of the sister facilities, or can you talk a little bit about how you brought people together to look at revising changes?
Well, I do work pretty closely with our with our sister facility, which is Thomas Hospital, which is in Fairhope, Alabama. And we are pretty much mirror images of each other when it comes to cardiac arrest. So when we do something, they typically do it as well. Now, we do have 2 freestanding emergency room. One is in Spanish Fort, Alabama, and the other one is in Saraland. And we have, done those drills as well with those facilities. And if they're going to send a patient here cardiac that has had a cardiac arrest, we don't have the Arctic Sun devices that can travel, but they do try to pack them in ice and get them here to us, and then we can facilitate putting our cooling pads on them once they get here to us.
Okay, great, thank you. We've had a few questions about broadly the recommended temperature guidelines and time guidelines for targeted temperature management. Could you, and you had a slide earlier with the algorithm from our newly updated 2020 guidelines that were released. Again, the link is in the chat there, so you can take a look at those on our website. But can you speak again just broadly as to the inclusion criteria and the temperature guidelines for cooling? I know, way back at the beginning.
American Heart recommends 32 to 36 degrees Celsius. Here at Mobile Infirmary, our Arctic Sun devices does cool to 33 degrees. He's gonna go back for me. Yeah, we have a set where we're cooling them to 33 degrees. And I did, when I was doing my research for this presentation looked at an article or a journal that had been published by the American Heart on people that thought that cooling to 32 or 36 didn't really show a difference. And Dr. Pearl, I don't know if you want to speak on a little bit more, but we do use 33 degrees as our set target here at Mobile Infirmary with our Arctic Sun devices.
Yeah, they haven't shown in trials that more severe hypothermia, like this is considered mild hypothermia, the degrees that we're talking about around 33 or 34, but going down below 32 and even down into the 20s just makes things more difficult to control for the patient in terms of their metabolic and cardiorespiratory status, but it doesn't actually improve their outcome anymore than just the milder ranges.
And Liz, you asked something about the inclusion criteria, correct?
Yes.
And also about the temperature we select, generally shivering, which makes cooling more difficult because you're having a warming process through muscle shivering and muscle activation. That happens more around 35 degrees. So once you get down closer to below 34, closer to 33, you have less shivering at that temperature as well.
Right, and then with the what I also was researching, I know different facilities use, different contraindications for use. But for the most part, we assess to make sure our patients aren't bleeding, to make sure they're not awake post code event, and then to see what their pre-arrest cognitive status was. So what was that CPC score, on admission, or what were they doing, when they arrested? What were they looking like at that time? Does that kind of answer what you were looking for, Liz?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I don't know if you have this at the ready, but we have some questions around how you managed patients on TTM when they were going to the OR or IR for procedures. I know you mentioned some of the devices could be used as they were going through different procedures, but can you talk about maybe the OR or IR specifically?
So I think that if you're going to go to an OR for open surgery, it's going to be very hard to cool the person. But if you're going to go in for some sort of minimally invasive procedure, or especially cardiac cath, you can cool these patients. A lot of physicians who aren't as familiar with hypothermia might think, oh, well, they're cold, we can't go to the cath lab or those sorts of things. But cooling is definitely not a contraindication to go to the cath lab. You can go and have a coronary stent or any other sort of procedure done in the cath lab while you are still cooling the patient. You can put the cooling pads on the patient while they're on the table in the cath lab. These patients are going to be intubated and sedated, so you don't have to worry about the patient moving, or if the patient is moving on you, then you probably shouldn't be cooling them. But yeah, just to emphasize that you can have minimally invasive and IR procedures done while either initiating cooling or actively being cooled. It should not scare people away.
And that was an issue that we did see with physicians not wanting to cool patients sometimes post cardiac arrest, because they said, well, we need to take them to the OR, they need to go to the cath lab. And like Dr. Pearl said, we had to do that education to say it's okay to keep cooling these patients while you take them to do your procedures. So yeah, we just roll it with them to wherever they're going.
Okay, that's great. So we have a few questions about how you worked with other providers across different areas of the hospitals. So specifically, like the CCU, is there any training that you did to get different physicians on board or different teams on board to change maybe their practices? And yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
I kind of harass doctors. I don't mind following you around to prove my point. But at our facility, a lot of the doctors like to look at numbers. You know, what do the numbers say? If I can show them where the data says that this works if you do this, that it doesn't take too much to sell most of them. And I'm talking about our critical care doctors. I've worked closely with them for so long. They kind of trust me at face value on a lot of the things, but we did do extra training to our emergency room staff and physicians, and then a lot of our critical care doctors who work between the CCU and MICU, and says, hey, we're doing a pretty sucky job of cooling patients, and we, you know, it doesn't hurt to try to do a better job. So a lot of them just were like, show me the facts, show me the numbers, and then after just kind of constantly harassing them and making the staff, you know, the code blue captains step up at the end of an event and say, hey, can we start cooling this patient? It really didn't take much to convince them that it was what we needed to do. It really was just like an out of sight, out of mind type of thing. And then those doctors who were reluctant to cool them, you know, to take them to surgical areas, when I really just kind of showed them, you know, what the science said about it, I didn't really get much pushback. But our physician staff here, when you take stuff through the committees, you know, I have to go through every physician committee when I try to do process improvement. And when the head of those facilities and they agree and they vote, you know, our CMO does a great job of going back and you know, communicating with the doctors that aren't on those committees. You know, this is what we agreed upon. This is what the policy says. You know, this is how we're going to proceed and go forward. We get a decent amount of buy-in from our physicians. They're very involved and they're going to try to do what's right. So I really didn't get much pushback from the physicians to help us go along this process improvement journey.
And we also formed a multi-specialty kind of a task force that identified a champion in all the different fields that were going to be involved. So you had a champion, usually a physician or a nurse leader champion from the emergency department. You had one from pulmonary critical care. You had one from cardiology. I was the representative of neurology. So, and you had critical care nursing. So all these different facets of the process that can or might possibly be involved. You try to get input from all of them, and then those champions can help distribute the education to their respective parts as well.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for the great questions. I'd like to thank Myra Smith and Dr. Harrison Pearl for presenting and leading today's webinar. And thank you to all of you for your participation in today's event. After today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email with a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. I also want to share we have a past webinar on the fundamentals of targeted temperature management that's available on our website, which you see here, heart.org/resuscitation. So you can view that recorded webinar as well, which talks a bit more about excuse me, the science behind targeted temperature management history and the inclusion criteria. Again, the 2020 American Heart Association CPR and ECC guidelines were updated last week, and you can access those through the link in the chat. On behalf of the American Heart Association, thank you again for joining us. Have a great day. This concludes today's presentation.